our 2019-2020 Killeen Chair of Philosophy and Theology lecture series. I'm Eric Hagedorn. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the college, and I'm also presently the chairperson of the Killeen Chair Committee. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd just like to really briefly let you know about the other lectures we're organizing under this year's theme of Must We Speak? Civic Responsibility in Times of Polarization. As you might know, tonight is our final event of the semester. Next spring, we have two more events. On Thursday, February 20th, we're going to be welcoming Dr. John Corvino, who's professor of philosophy at Wayne State University in Michigan. He will speak on civility, its uses and abuses in public discourse. For those of you who are not familiar with the name, Dr. Corvino is notable for his commitment to the practice of civil discourse with those who disagree with him quite contentiously. He's best known for co-authoring several books on heated political topics, such as same-sex marriage, legal protections for religious liberty, and the like. And for each of those books, his co-author is someone who's on the exact opposite side of the intellectual spectrum from him. So we're greatly looking forward to that lecture, and we hope you'll be able to make it back here for that on February 20th. And then our series will close on Thursday, March 26th, when Dr. Maria Teresa Davila from Merrimack College will be here. She'll be speaking on From Civility to Justice, Conversations Across the Aisle for Human Dignity and the Common Good. And so we hope you'll be able to join us for both of those events. Following tonight's lecture, if you've been here before, you might know, we'll have a brief period of question and answer here in the theater, and then we invite you to continue the conversation out in the lobby, where we'll have some refreshments and copies of Dr. Nadler's book should be on sale. I'd like to now welcome to the podium my colleague, Dr. Paul Johnson, Associate Dean of Humanities here at St. Norbert College, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Eric. We're very pleased indeed and honored to have with us tonight Dr. Stephen Nadler to present the second in this year's series of Killeen Chair public lectures devoted to the theme, Must We Speak? Civic Responsibilities in Times of Polarization. Professor Nadler is the William H. Hay Professor of Philosophy, the Evu Bascom Professor in the Humanities, and the Weinstein Bascom Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Nadler received his master's and doctoral degrees from Columbia University in New York and began his career at Madison in 1988. Professor Nadler has served the profession of philosophy in many ways and over many years. He serves and has served on the editorial boards of the Journal of the History of Ideas, Journal of Modern Philosophy, New Studies in the History and Historiography of Philosophy, and the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. In these editorial capacities, Dr. Nadler has worked to shape the contours of professional scholarship devoted to works in the early modern period and has an enduring effect on our understanding of those authors. He's also served as the president of the American Philosophical Association Central Division. He is the author of scores of scholarly articles, and his works have appeared in leading journals over the full span of his career. He writes extensively on the work of one of the Western tradition's most important and difficult authors, the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, including a highly regarded biography, Spinoza, A Life, and an introductory text on that most challenging of philosophical works in any age, the Ethics. More recently, we find a book, Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age, and the forthcoming Think Least All of Death, Spinoza as Moral Philosopher. In all of his scholarly writings, and I've enjoyed quite a few of them, those of us who are fascinated by Spinoza, those of us who struggle with those works, owe Professor Nadler a profound debt of gratitude. He has achieved something truly extraordinary. He makes Spinoza clear, at any rate clearer. He has demonstrated the relevance, the profundity of this philosopher's vision, and also its profound significance for the current age. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Stephen Nadler.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on this blustery night. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to give this Killeen Chair lecture. Maybe the first time that Spinoza has ever been presented in this forum, but I hope you'll see he fits the theme quite well. If you think that we're living in times of questionable civility in politics today, you should have seen the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, where people were literally being torn to pieces. In 1672, the famous incident where the leader of the Dutch Republic was torn apart by a mob which thought he had betrayed the Dutch to the French. His body was torn to pieces. There were reports of cannibalism, and the parts of his body were strung up in the square and in The Hague. My paper's missing. Sorry, technical difficulties. Is there somebody in the audience who took away some of the paper? It's in here. Oh wait, here we go. Yeah, you got it. You took it up when you left the podium. So looking forward to it. All right, let's calm down now. Baruch Spinoza was, without question, the most radical and controversial philosopher of his time. His theological political treatise, published in 1670, 14 years after his excommunication from Amsterdam's Portuguese congregation, was immediately and widely condemned by ecclesiastic bodies, civil authorities, university theologians, and even progressive philosophers. It was called the most blasphemous book ever published, an atheistic and soul-destroying work that was forged in hell by the devil himself. In the treatise, Spinoza argues that miracles, understood as violations of the laws of nature, are impossible. It's not just that you're never justified in believing in a miracle. Rather, miracles are impossible, metaphysically impossible. They cannot happen. He also argues that biblical prophecy is nothing but edifying imaginative storytelling, and that the Bible is not literally of divine origin, but a very flawed work of human literature whose composition was grounded in historical and political circumstances. The Bible, thus, is not necessarily a source of truth, but only a simple and important moral message. Love your fellow human beings and treat them with justice and charity. That, he says, is true religion. For the true religion, what matters is not what you believe, but how you treat other human beings. What I want to do this evening, however, is approach Spinoza's philosophy from a different perspective, one that I hope will show the great and continued relevance of this 17th century philosopher. The general issue is toleration. More particularly, I want to focus on two questions. First, the separation of church and state, and second, freedom of speech. First, I will examine a common conception about Spinoza's views on the relationship between religion and the state, and show why it is in fact a misconception. That Spinoza is not in fact who he is very often taken to be on the question of religious toleration. Second, I want to argue that Spinoza, despite his well-deserved reputation for being a strong defender of toleration in general, in fact does not go far enough and makes a potentially troubling concession to the legitimacy of state censorship. When I say he doesn't go far enough, I mean not only with respect to our broad contemporary ideals of toleration, since I don't want to hold Spinoza to any anachronistic standards. Although remember that the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment was established in 1791, just barely 100 years after Spinoza's death. But I also want to say that with respect to his own standards that were indeed exceedingly liberal for his time, but that I shall suggest he does not stand by with sufficient consistency. So even by Spinoza's own very liberal, even radical standards, he doesn't go far enough. And yet, it seems that in light of recent events, Spinoza's principal stand on freedom of speech is at least more than we have seen lately from recent presidential administration. I'm referring both to the past administration of Barack Obama and his Department of Justice, as well as the current administration of Donald Trump. And I would suggest that both these presidents and their minions would have done and would do well to read Spinoza. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This complex and often debated proposition, comprised of both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, is usually taken to be a clear and paradigmatic statement of the doctrine of separation of church and state. As Thomas Jefferson puts it, the First Amendment should be seen as, quote, building a wall of separation between church and state. The government may neither contribute to the promotion of any religious worship, but neither may it prevent people from observing any religious rites or ceremonies, at least so long as those activities are carried out in a peaceful manner that doesn't deserve the public welfare. 200 years earlier, that is earlier than Jefferson, freedom of religion was enshrined among the founding tenets of Spinoza's own Dutch Republic. I should say his own Dutch Republic. Spinoza was of Portuguese Jewish background, but his family fled the Inquisitions in Spain and Portugal and eventually ended up in Amsterdam, where Spinoza was born. So even though he himself was not of Converso or Portuguese, he wasn't born in Portugal, he was of Portuguese background. His first language was Portuguese, but he was very Dutch in many ways. So the founding tenets of the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces of the Netherlands, their founding document or constitution was called the Union of Utrecht. And Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht, which functioned as a kind of constitution for the newly independent nation, they had just liberated themselves from Spain. This article says, quote, every individual should remain free in his religion, and no man should be molested or questioned on the subject of divine worship. That is a remarkable statement for the 17th century. The leaders of the Dutch Republic in this period may not have always been faithful to this principle, and they certainly did not believe in the separation of church and state in the Republic. The Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, was, if not the established church, like the Anglican Church in England, at least a formally privileged one. Still, this was for the period an unusually high freedom of religion in Holland and the other Dutch provinces. As the author of a theological political work, and having prepared the ground for his discussions of prophecy, faith, scripture, and political theory, Spinoza must finally address in the theological political treatise what he views as the proper relationship between state and religion. And it is usually assumed that he was a strong early proponent of the separation of church and state, and that he, along with John Locke, laid the foundations for future religious toleration. One recent commentator, echoing what many others have claimed, even writes that, and this is a quote, the spirit of Spinoza lives on in the opening words of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the phrase referred to as the Establishment Clause. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. So that I really shouldn't say that, because there are things that could be further from the truth. Like if we said Spinoza was a faithful Catholic, that would be even further from the truth. But I think that's to misunderstand Spinoza. The separation of church and state can mean a number of things. Spinoza did believe that when it comes to religious belief, people should be left alone to believe or not believe whatever they want. It's impossible to control people's beliefs anyway. And there's no way to monitor what goes on in their minds. True piety, what he calls the inward worship of God, is an entirely personal matter. In fact, if you start to try to control people's beliefs, you're only going to make them resentful and rebellious. It should be a matter not only of necessity, but of right, that is left to the individual alone. This is our first quote from Spinoza. Since religion consists in honesty and sincerity of heart rather than in outward actions, it does not pertain to the sphere of public law and authority. Honesty and sincerity of heart is not imposed on man by legal command or by the state's authority. It is an absolute fact that nobody can be constrained to a state of blessedness by force of law. That's just a basic psychological fact. As the sovereign right to free opinion belongs to every man, even in matters of religion, and it is inconceivable that any man can surrender this right, there also belongs to every man the sovereign right and supreme authority to judge freely with regard to religion, and consequently to explain it and interpret it for himself or herself. As we shall see, Spinoza also argues for the free expression of one's religious beliefs, verbally or in writing, and that this should be tolerated by the state. No one should ever be prosecuted for heresy or irreligion. However, if the separation of church and state means what it is usually taken to mean in the free exercise and establishment clauses of the Constitution, that government may not regulate or formally endorse any particular set of religious practices or outward forms of religion, of worship, then here the founders of the American Republic have parted company with Spinoza. According to Spinoza, in the properly ordered state, the government or sovereign power, whether we're talking about a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy, the sovereign power is charged with overseeing all matters of public well-being. Any actions or practices that enter into the public sphere and that therefore may possibly affect the welfare of the people and the state, all such things are now the responsibility of the government, all public activities. The state's laws and decrees must be directed towards peace, security, and the stability of the polity, and its legislators must take care to regulate institutions whose activities have some bearing on security, peace, and stability. By contrast, anything that is not related to the public good, such as private beliefs, is not within the state's purview. It follows then that the government's power extends only to the promulgation of civil laws. Not only to the promulgation of civil laws, but also to laying down religious laws as well, at least insofar as these are related to piety in the form of public activities. The inner worship of God and the feelings of love toward one's neighbors, which for Spinoza constitute the true religion, all of that is to be left to each individual. But the outer form in which this worship and love are to be practiced, that is, whatever rites and ceremonies are to be observed, and especially the expression of obedience to God and the love of one's neighbor through justice and charity in action, all of that does fall in the public domain because it's a matter of action, how you treat other people. And thus, it is within the sovereign's sphere of authority. This is the next quote, I hope. Maybe not. Did you do something here too? Does anybody know how to forward? So what are we doing? Oh, this one. Our next quote. The welfare of the people is the highest law, to which all other laws, both human and divine, must be made to conform. But since it is the duty of the sovereign alone to decide what is necessary for the welfare of the people and the security of the state, and to command what it judges to be thus necessary, it follows that it is also the duty of the sovereign alone to decide what form piety towards one's neighbor should take. That is, in what way every man is required to obey God. This means that the sovereign, and by sovereign I mean the government, whoever is in charge of the government, is responsible for what Spinoza calls the interpretation of religion. Individual citizens are, of course, free to read and interpret the Bible or other religious texts for themselves and to discover its exhortations to justice and charity. By the way, for Spinoza, the Bible is only divine in the sense that it inspires people to treat other human beings with justice and charity. If reading Shakespeare inspires you to justice and charity, then Shakespeare's plays are divine. If reading the Bible inspires you to acts of violence and evil, then the Bible is not divine. It all depends upon the Bible's effect or the work of literature's effect upon you. So all individuals are at liberty to read the Bible and other religious texts and do this however they can and with whatever metaphysical, theological, and historical beliefs may help them toward proper pious behavior. You can believe about God whatever you want. But in a democracy, Spinoza's preferred form of government, the governing assembly is to decide how God's law is to be translated into public practice, since that public assembly has sole authority to decide what activities are consistent with the public welfare. Fingers crossed. There we go. Wait, no, sorry, should have been there. No one can exercise piety towards his neighbor in accordance with God's command unless his piety and religion conform to the public good. But no private citizen can know what is good for the state except from the decrees of the sovereign, to whom alone it belongs to transact public business. Therefore, no one can practice piety aright, nor obey God, unless they obey the decrees of the sovereign in all things. Notice that Spinoza says that the organization and control of religion is the duty of the sovereign alone. Among those private citizens who are not qualified to make judgments about the public good and thus dictate outward forms of worship, including ceremonial rites, are the clergy. Spinoza has fully removed the supervision of religion from sectarian leaders and put it firmly in the hands of the civil authority. The sovereign is free to appoint ecclesiastics to act as its ministers in religious affairs, but these representatives serve at the pleasure of and are fully subordinate to the secular authority. Let me add that civil control of religious affairs, while no doubt offensive to early modern ecclesiastics, was in fact a prominent theme in 17th century Dutch Republican thought. And Spinoza was not alone in his views on this matter. For Spinoza and a number of his contemporaries, in the ideal state, there is to be one and only one form of public devotion, and it is to be determined and supervised by the civil authority. Do whatever you want in your homes, believe whatever you want in your minds, say whatever you want to whoever you want to say it to. But in terms of worship, public worship, the state is the authority. Spinoza's intention is certainly not to institute a state religion with compulsory religious observance, and he especially does not want the sovereign to dictate religious dogma. No one is to be forced to believe or to worship anything, to join any gathering, or to engage in any ceremonial practices. Go to church, go to synagogue, go to your mosque, or don't. It doesn't matter. Such enforced piety and mandated uniformity would not be consistent with the primary aim of the state, which is to increase the rationality and freedom of its citizens and ensure civic peace. Spinoza is not interested in seeing totalitarian control over people's lives. Rather, his position is based on the fear that without such singular secular control over religious matters, there is a real danger to the well-being of the Commonwealth. In fact, the greatest threat to civil peace, both in theory and as ancient and contemporary events have shown, including the biblical period, the greatest threat to civil peace are the divisions introduced into society by sectarian religions. The multiplication of large-scale organized religions, even the existence of one major organized religion distinct from the official public one, will ultimately weaken even a powerful and prosperous society. Sectarian religions set citizens against one another, Christians against Jews, Protestants against Catholics, and even Protestants against Protestants. More importantly, it sets citizens against the state itself. As soon as there are alternative sources of authority besides the sovereign, the loyalty of citizens is divided. There are now states within the state. It becomes a legitimate question as to whether the citizens are devoted to the polity at large and the general welfare or to their more narrow sectarian causes. This was why the Dutch Republic would not allow Catholics to publicly worship in the 17th century, because Catholics would be of suspect loyalty to the Republic. Are they more devoted to the Pope in Rome, to the King of Spain, or to the Republic itself? A commonwealth within which there is such a division of loyalties, with piety opposed to patriotism, cannot last long. It will eventually disintegrate under the pressure of civil discord. As the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes succinctly puts it, no man can serve two masters. The problem becomes particularly acute when religious ecclesiastics themselves seek influence over not just the hearts and minds of their congregants, but the social and moral lives of its citizens. It is, in fact, inevitable that the ecclesiastics, once allowed their independent sectarian domains, will encroach upon the civil power and strive for supremacy over it. The result of such a usurpation of political authority is a division of sovereignty in the Commonwealth, and in the end, its downfall. Thus, for Spinoza, in the model state, there is to be only one established religion, and it will be overseen by the civil sovereign. Spinoza does allow that there can be independent congregations of worship, even, it seems, a plurality of sects. However, there will have to be restrictions. He says the houses of these little religions have to be small. They can't be big buildings because they will draw people away from the sanctioned state religion, the national religion. The house of worship of the national religion, by contrast, he says, should be large and costly. Let me turn now to the more general question of the toleration. You know, I think I'm stepping on the keyboard and advancing things. Anyway, we'll see. Let me now turn to the more general question of toleration and freedom of speech. Spinoza is, without question, one of history's most eloquent proponents of a secular, democratic society and the strongest advocate for freedom and toleration in the early modern period. After all, the ultimate goal of his scandalous theological political treatise is enshrined in both the book's subtitle and in the arguments of its final chapter, to show that the freedom of philosophizing not only can be granted without detriment to public peace and piety and to the right of the sovereign, but also that it must be granted if these are to be preserved. To begin with, there is the question of the toleration of beliefs. And we've already seen this evening what Spinoza has to say about the freedom of religious belief. We have already seen that what Spinoza says about the freedom of religious beliefs, in fact, applies to all beliefs whatsoever. They are absolutely to be free and unimpeded, both by right and in fact. hang on. There we go. It is impossible for the mind to be completely under another's control. I like the fact that none of you pointed out that this thing was going forward as I was speaking without any relationship whatsoever to what I was saying. Thanks for the help. It is impossible for the mind to be completely under another's command, for no one is able to transfer to another his natural right or faculty to reason freely and to form his own judgment on any matters whatsoever, nor can he be compelled to do so. Indeed, any effort on the sovereign's part to rule over the beliefs and opinions of citizens can only backfire, as it will ultimately serve to undermine the sovereign's own authority. In a passage that strikes the reader as both obviously right and extraordinarily bold for its time, Spinoza writes that a government that attempts to control men's minds is regarded as tyrannical, and a sovereign is thought to wrong his subjects and infringe their right when he seeks to prescribe for every man what he should accept as true and reject as false, and what are the beliefs that will inspire him with devotion to God. All these are matters belonging to individual right, which no man can surrender, even if he should so wish. A sovereign is certainly free to try to limit what people think, but the result of such a foolhardy policy would be to create only resentment and opposition to the sovereign's rule. The freedom of opinion is, for Spinoza, an inalienable right. Still, the toleration of belief is easy because it's necessary. The more difficult case, that is practically necessary, the more difficult case and the true test of a philosopher's commitment to toleration concerns the liberty of citizens to express those beliefs either in speech or in writing. And here, Spinoza goes further than anyone else in the 17th century. Utter failure will attend any attempt in a commonwealth to force men to speak only as prescribed by the sovereign, despite their different and opposing opinions. The most tyrannical government will be the one where the individual is denied the freedom to express and to communicate to others what he thinks, and a moderate government is one where this freedom is granted to every man. Spinoza's argument for freedom of expression is based both on the right or power of citizens to speak as they desire, as well as the fact that, just like in the case of belief, it would be self-defeating for a government to try to restrain that freedom of speech. No matter what laws are enacted against speech and other means of expression, citizens will continue to say what they believe because they can, only now they will do so in secret. He says, and this is a quote, "It is far beyond the bounds of possibility that all men can be made to speak to order. On the contrary, the greater the effort to deprive them of freedom of speech, the more obstinately will they resist." The result of the suppression of freedom is once again resentment and a weakening of the bonds that unite subjects to sovereign. In Spinoza's view, intolerant laws lead ultimately to anger, revenge, and sedition. The attempt to enforce them is a great danger to the state. Spinoza also argues for freedom of expression on utilitarian grounds. It is necessary for progress in the discovery of truth and the spread of creativity. Without an open marketplace of ideas, science, philosophy, art, and other disciplines are stifled in their development to the technological, economic, and even aesthetic detriment of society. In this respect, Spinoza's defense of liberty foreshadows the one that John Stuart Mill would offer 2 centuries later in his essay on liberty. As Spinoza puts it, this freedom of expressing one's ideas is of the first importance in fostering the sciences and the arts, for it is only those whose judgment is free and unbiased who can attain success in these fields. For Spinoza, then, there is to be no criminalization of ideas in the well-ordered state. What he calls the freedom of philosophizing must be upheld for the sake of a healthy, secure, and peaceful commonwealth, and material and intellectual progress. He says, what greater misfortune can be imagined for a state than that honorable men should be exiled as miscreants because their opinions are at variance with authority and they cannot disguise the fact? What can be more calamitous than that men should be regarded as enemies and put to death, not for any crime or misdeed, but for being independent minds? Spinoza's views on liberty go beyond what was envisioned by another philosopher renowned for his defense of toleration, John Locke. Locke was primarily interested in the toleration within a society of a variety of religious ideas, so that individuals may enjoy the uninhibited personal communion with God in which religion consists. In his letter on toleration from 1685, Locke argued that no religious group, nor even the state, has the right to persecute those who belong to other religious sects. Membership in a community of believers is voluntary, and thus no church may force or engage the power of the state to further its narrow sectarian aims. Different forms of religion and worship and theological dissent are and must be allowed, even encouraged, in the Commonwealth. That's Locke. Locke was clearly impressed by the economic fruits of toleration that he saw in the Dutch Republic, where he was residing when he wrote this letter. However, Locke makes one significant exception to the general policy of openness for religious and secular ideas. And that is, for Locke, there is to be no toleration of atheism. Since atheists do not believe in God, they have no foundation for morality, and thus they cannot be trusted not to act in ways that are harmful to their fellow citizens. Locke's refusal to grant the same freedom to atheists that he provides for believers is therefore made on political and ethical rather than religious grounds. And apparently it's not only freedom of expression that is being denied to atheists, but freedom of belief, since their mere presence in the state is supposed to be a threat to its welfare. I believe that this represents an inconsistency in Locke's thought and a striking failure of toleration, one that is absent from Spinoza's account. However, and here's where our problems begin, Spinoza, I think, does not support absolute freedom of speech. He explicitly states that the expression of what he calls seditious ideas is not to be tolerated by the sovereign. There is to be no protection of speech. There's to be no protection for speech that advocates the overthrow of the government, disobedience to its laws, or harm to its fellow citizens. The people are free to argue for the repeal of laws that they find unreasonable and oppressive, but they must do so peacefully and through rational argument. And if their argument fails to persuade the sovereign to change the law, then that must be the end of the matter. What they may not do, he says, is stir up popular hatred against the sovereign or his representatives. I think in this respect, Spinoza would be opposed to civil disobedience. I don't know how many of you have read Plato's Crito, but how many of you have read Plato's Crito in a philosophy class? So it looks like Socrates is arguing for absolute obedience to the state. Whatever the state commands, you have to do, even if the state commands you to kill or be killed. But he also says you could try to persuade the state. Persuade or obey. And the question is, does persuasion allow for civil disobedience? Is civil disobedience a form of persuasion? If so, then Socrates allows for civil disobedience. But Spinoza, it seems, limits persuasion to verbal persuasion. And if you fail, you have to obey. Absolutists about the freedom of speech will be troubled by these caveats on Spinoza's part, and rightly so. After all, who is to decide what kind of speech will count as seditious? May not the sovereign declare to be seditious simply those views with which it disagrees? or that it finds contrary to its policies? Spinoza, presumably to allay such concerns, does offer a definition of seditious political beliefs. He says it is those beliefs that, quote, immediately have the effect of annulling the covenant whereby everyone has surrendered his right to act just as he thinks fit. The salient feature of seditious opinions is presumably what he calls the action that is implicit within, not unlike the limitations on our First Amendment that incitement to action, like yelling fire in a crowded theater, that is not permissible speech. So for Spinoza, it's the action that is implicit within such speech. That is, those speech acts are more or less verbal incitements to act against the sovereign, and thus they would be directly contrary to the social contract of citizenship. Other beliefs, he says, in which there is no implication of action, such as the breaking of the social contract, the exactation of revenge, and the indulgence of anger and so forth, he says, are not seditious. However, this still leaves a considerable gap for the unreasonable censorship of the expression of ideas. Engaging in speech that immediately contributes toward weakening the political compact, it could be done directly, let's say by incendiary words intended to stir up disobedience. Let's go kill the prime minister, for example. But it could also be done indirectly by spreading subversive beliefs about the sovereign. Let's say the president is mentally ill, such as a rumor, for example, that the leader's policies are treasonous, or even a rumor that the leader's rule is illegitimate. In the United States, this might be exemplified by the so-called birther movement, the right-wing fringe who kept insisting that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and thus does not legitimately hold the presidency. Among the things that Spinoza says are not to be allowed is accusing the magistrate of injustice. If there's an implication of action or an immediate effect of annulling the social covenant, in this case, it's at best pretty obscure. It's not clear then that Spinoza's position really amounts to the view, as one scholar puts it, that the expression of opinions only becomes subversive and hence liable for punishment if it directly obstructs implementation of the laws. It seems a rather hazy boundary here between legitimate dissent and protest, which for Spinoza is protected, and being an agitator and rebel, which is not. What's the boundary there? Spinoza may feel that he has provided an unambiguous criterion and identified a small and well-circumscribed domain. Did I do that again? No, that's all right. It looks like he still has a well-circumscribed domain for what is to count as seditious speech, and thereby he has set a firewall against the arbitrary abuse of state power over the expression of ideas. But still, there appears in his philosophy to remain a loophole for a clever sovereign to engage in and justify a potentially extensive suppression of ideas, including prior restraint of the press, the censorship of books, and even the prohibition of meetings. Perhaps Spinoza should have more consistently followed the logic of his own reasoning by drawing the line not within the realm of belief, that is, including the expression of belief, but at the border of belief and its expression on the one hand, and true actions on the other. Let the sovereign regulate action, but let beliefs, including the expressions of beliefs, be untouchable. It was only the right to act as he thought fit that each man surrendered, and not his right to reason and judge. So while to act against the sovereign's decree is definitely an infringement of his, that is, the sovereign's right, This is not the case with thinking, judging, and consequently with speaking too. Now, it might be, in fact, objected that Spinoza does draw a line between what the government can and cannot legitimately monitor. And he draws that line right at the border between ideas on the one hand and action on the other hand. And perhaps he considers the expression of beliefs a matter of action. And that would mean it would be perfectly consistent with his principles of toleration to allow the sovereign to censor speech. After all, it would then be an action. However, Spinoza doesn't really argue in this way. He does not say that the expression of ideas is an action and therefore is in the domain of the sovereign's control. Rather, he argues that those expressions of ideas that have an action that is implicit in them, speech that is a call or incitement to action, this is subject to government control. And thus he maintains the distinction between ideas and their expression on the one hand and action on the other hand, but then allows censorship to infect the realm of ideas and their expression. Spinoza does seem to construe action implicit in speech much more broadly than the U.S. Supreme Court has done over the years in its rulings on what may legitimately count as fighting words and thus be subject to prescription. Flag burning, for example, which the Supreme Court in 1969 declared to be merely offensive but not fighting words, would probably not be allowed under Spinoza's principles. Perhaps the same would be true about the burning of the Quran, recently threatened by a pastor in Florida. On the other hand, Spinoza's principles of toleration come out looking much better than those defended by the Obama administration and some recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions. In 2010, the Supreme Court declared constitutional a law that, among other things, criminalized certain kinds of speech. The speech in question need not be extremely and imminently threatening to anyone or pose a clear and present danger. It is a far cry from shouting fire in a crowded theater. The speech, in fact, may involve no incitement to action or violence whatsoever, and in fact, it can even be an exhortation to nonviolence, but the Supreme Court ruled that it may not be permissible. Here's the case. This was a 6-3 decision by the Supreme Court during the Obama administration, and Obama's Attorney General, Holder, was the one who prosecuted the Humanitarian Law Project. And in this case, the court upheld a federal statute which makes it a crime to provide so-called material support to a foreign group that has been designated by the Secretary of State as a terrorist organization. The Obama administration argued that political and legal advice in the form of speech falls under the category of material support. And so the government, in a brief prepared by the Solicitor General, who at the time was a Solicitor General, Elena Kagan, on behalf of Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General, the administration argued that the law, in fact, regarded only conduct, not the content of the speech, and therefore needed to pass only the intermediate scrutinary test by furthering an important government interest. And the government nonetheless argued that this compelling interest, combating terrorism, justified it in restricting the activity in question, which was speech, and that is ordinarily protected by the First Amendment. The case was the Humanitarian Law Project was advising the Kurdish People's political party on how to engage in nonviolent activity, essentially how to turn themselves from a violent group into a nonviolent group. And because the United States had declared the Kurdish People's Party a terrorist organization, the Humanitarian Law Project was forbidden from giving them any kind of advice, even advice on how to become peaceful. And this seems to me, and it seems to a lot of people opposed to this court decision, that this is a violation of the First Amendment. It was banned. Would such a ban be permissible under a Spinoza administration? I am fairly certain that it would not. And I remain puzzled why the Obama administration decided to act as it did. An administration is not absolutely required to defend a law passed by Congress if it does not believe in that law's constitutionality. Spinoza is certainly conscious of and willing to allow for some potentially unpleasant consequences entailed by the broad respect for civil liberties. There will be public disputes, even factionalism, as citizens express their opposing views on political, social, moral, and religious questions. This, however, is what comes with a healthy, democratic, and tolerant society. As he concedes, what cannot be prohibited must necessarily be allowed, even if harm ensues. The proper state will be very much like 17th century Amsterdam itself, which, while not truly democratic, Spinoza nonetheless greatly admires for the freedom that it allows its citizens and the flourishing that such toleration has brought to the city. Take the city of Amsterdam, which enjoys the fruits of this freedom to its own considerable prosperity and the admiration of the world. In this flourishing state, the city of highest renown, men of every race and sect live in complete harmony and believe in trusting their property to some person they will want to know no more than this, whether he is rich or poor, or in whether he has been honest or dishonest in his dealings. As for religion or sect, that is of no account, because such considerations are regarded as irrelevant in a court of law, and no sect whatsoever is so hated that its adherents, provided that they injure no one, render to each what is his own, and live upright lives, are denied the protection of the civil authorities. I don't think Spinoza really believes all of that. I think he believes that Amsterdam did not live up to its own ideals. Catholics were discriminated against. Jews were not allowed to join the guilds. And anti-Trinitarian Protestants were severely persecuted at times during the Dutch Republic's era. And in fact, it's surprising to see Spinoza write this, because one of his close friends has just died in prison, condemned by the city of Amsterdam for his philosophical and religious ideas. So perhaps there's a good deal of bitter irony in Spinoza's words here. On the other hand, Amsterdam was the most liberal and tolerant city in a republic renowned in its own time for religious and political toleration, and Spinoza, while aware of the city's shortcomings, also knew well and appreciated its virtues. In conclusion, one can only hope that perhaps Spinoza himself was uncomfortable with the restrictions that he had placed on freedom of speech, and that deep down, he really was an absolutist on this matter. In the penultimate paragraph of the Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza does draw a clear line between ideas and their expression on the one hand, and actions on the other. And he insists, this time without any qualification, that the sovereign's authority should be restricted to the latter. He says the state can pursue no safer course than to regard piety and religion as consisting solely in the exercise of charity and just dealing, and the right of the sovereign, both in religious and secular spheres, should be restricted to men's actions, with everyone being allowed to think what he will and to say what he thinks. This sentence, a wonderful statement of the principle of toleration, is perhaps the real lesson of Spinoza's Theological Political Treatise, and should be that for which he is remembered. It is also a lesson that our very own executive branch and the U.S. Supreme Court would do well to heed. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for just a handful of questions.
That's a great question. So there, it's not so much the freedom of expression that would, if let's say I go with a yes answer, he would be in favor of harsher penalties for hate crimes. Would that be an instance of actually punishing the expression of an idea? What makes the question so difficult is because there the idea is so embedded in the action, and it's hard to separate the two and say, well, I'm certain he would be. Okay, I'm not so certain of this. I was going to say I'm certain he would be in favor of the free expression of hateful ideas, but given the passages I looked at, which suggest that he allows for some restrictions, and seeing as how the publication of racist, anti-Semitic, and other forms of hate divide citizens and cause trouble in the state, it may be that because his commitment to the toleration of free speech is not absolute, he might, in fact, be in favor of repressing, not just of additional penalties for hate crimes, but maybe even in favor of the suppression of the publication of hateful ideas. That of course is the great test of one's commitment to freedom of speech. So he published the Theological Political Treatise in 1670. He wrote it in Latin, and he didn't put his name on the cover. The friend of his who had been thrown in jail 2 years earlier had published a very Spinozistic work, but he wrote it in Dutch, and he put his name on the cover. He got thrown in jail. When Spinoza published the treatise, the liberal regions, Amsterdam and Holland, were still in the hands of the liberals. And even though they were getting pressure from the Reformed Church to find out who wrote this damned book, they could say, oh, we don't know, there's no name on the cover. Within a year or so, everybody knew who wrote the book, but they had plausible deniability. In 1672, when what the Dutch call a total overhaul of the political and religious life of the Republic, Spinoza realized that he couldn't publish his other philosophical masterpiece, the Ethics. And he also put a stop to a Dutch translation of the Theological Political Treatise. So he realized that the times had changed. And even in Amsterdam, the new regent body was not going to be as tolerant as the old regent body. I think he was really angry. The Ethics is a very dispassionate work of moral philosophy. The Theological Political Treatise is a very angry work. And these words about the passage I showed about Amsterdam, he's pissed at Amsterdam. And he's angry at the Dutch Republic for betraying its own founding principles. Can you hear her question over? Okay. Yes. So even if it turned out, the question is, even if it turns out that, as a matter of fact, you can control people's beliefs, that would be a mere empirical claim, but there's still the normative claim that you have the right. And the arguments he gives, besides the difficulty of controlling people's beliefs. And in fact, I think I've heard from psychologists with whom I've discussed this say, oh yeah, you can control people's beliefs. You do it by operant conditioning, you do it by propaganda. There are various ways of doing it, and sometimes people just don't know they're being controlled in ways. However, that would be to violate people's right to believe as they will. So if you could do it, whether you can do it openly or subliminally, you have somehow crossed, maybe you've engage in something that's practically possible, you've crossed a moral line. But also, there's the other practical argument is that you will have harmed not just the person, but society by working invidiously on people's beliefs in this way. Let's say to increase conformity, you're undermining social progress.
Yeah. So if we could thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
And if you would like, again, you're all welcome to continue the conversation in the lobby where there are